Satisfied.
Even though some might be still eating, we'll read from the scripture. It says, "So eat and be satisfied, and you'll bless Adonai, your God, for good land He's given us." Let's do that. Abba, we have eaten and we're satisfied, and we thank you for the land. It's in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Can we do it again when I'm done?
Sure.
You had your chance.
But change it to "I have eaten and I'm satisfied."
Yeah.
So we are still, this is the Midrash for Torah portion by Vayaqhel. This was the first verse, and the first word in the verse is Vayaqhel, which is translated as assembled, as you see in these three different translations. And Moshe assembled, Moses assembled, then Moses assembled. And then these are things which Adonai has ordered you to do. If you go back and ordered or commanded, those are two different things. Go back to this. You see the word tzivah, which you're looking at the. If you look at the second line, count from right to left: 1, 2, 3, 4-5. The fifth word there is tzivah, which is the word you might recognize as command. Or ordered, I guess would be a way. That's how Complete Jewish Bible translate that. So this was the Aliyot. We read from 2 Kings and from Matthew chapter 17. And the mitzvot of the portion, the only one. So there's not, and that was already given away in the fun challenge, so there's not going to be a question on that. But one traditional interpretation of the mitzvah from this portion is derived out as the court must not inflict punishment on Shabbat. Doesn't seem like it's a direct derivative of that. I would agree that the court must not inflict punishment on Shabbat, in that if Shabbat is a day of rest, I would say they're probably not using kindled flame to inflict punishment, but maybe that was a punishment that was used. I don't know. And the kindle of the flame, as we mentioned, is in the text as from the word ba'ar. And if you're looking at how it was understood within the Septuagint translation, you can see that the verb tense is active. And when you look down in the lexicon, you see that active indicates light something, kindle, or ignite. Passive would be just to let it be lit or to let it burn. This is in, just as the Hebrew text as kindle, so does the Greek text understanding that as well. When in history this happened, according to Rashi, he concluded that the events of this Torah portion happened the day after Yom Kippur. And since there's a bit of a repetition, you remember the listing of the things that were done, there was a kind of a repetition of all the things that you're being told to do. So it's kind of a summation of being told to do those things for building the tabernacle. Since Moses assembled Israel to collect the gold for the Mishkan, the gold being an atonement for the sin of the golden calf, he most likely did this immediately after they were forgiven, i.e. the day after Yom Kippur. That's Rashi's reasoning. So it's a reasoned answer. It's not necessarily based on anything in the text saying this is what had happened directly. So take a look at work in this text. This Hebrew word for work here is melacha. And that's where it says, this from Art 12, for example, in 6 days work may be done, but the seventh day should be holy for you, a day of complete rest for Hashem. Whoever does work on it shall be put to death. So what is the definition of melacha? So we can derive the definition of it from other uses of it and how it's used. One thing that is true is that melacha is the type of work that Elohim rested from. Back in Bereshit or Genesis chapter 2, he rested from his work on Shabbat. We see that in last week's portion, melacha was translated as craftsmanship. It's the work of skilled craftsmen building the tabernacle. That's melacha. And this is in 31:14 and 15. This is how it is translated as well. This is from, again, last week's portion. Therefore, you keep my Shabbat because it is set apart for you. Everyone who treats it as ordinary must be put to death. Whoever does any work on it is to be cut off from his people. On 6 days you will work. On 6 days work will get done, but the seventh day is a Shabbat for complete rest, set apart for Adonai. Whoever does any work on the day of Shabbat must be put to death. So that was repeated this week in our reading, a very similar passage. So even though the tabernacle was extremely important to get completed, it was outranked, if you will, by Sabbath. So even though the tabernacle was important, you were not to work on Shabbat to get it set up,
Right.
or built, so to speak. The work of skilled craftsmen would cease. So we saw from the text that whatever work was involved in creating, that when Yah created, and whatever work is required to make the tabernacle, are among those types of work that are not normally permitted on Shabbat. And we'll take a look a little bit later at Isaiah 58:13. Speaking your own word is a potential reference to the creative work. We'll talk a little more about that in a minute or two. We see from another passage that from Exodus 16:23 that cooking, baking, boiling of food is to be done before Shabbat. And so those types of actions are prohibited in melacha on Shabbat. From this portion, kindling a fire in your moshav on the Shabbat is prohibited, melacha type of work. And in the Complete Jewish Bible, I want to translate that as in your home, but what would be perhaps a better translation for moshav than home? Community or settlement, dwelling place. Yeah. And in a moshav in modern understanding is basically a community, a village in some
You mean
place.
a kibbutz?
Could be, yeah, but it's more than just your home. And when we think about how people didn't have ovens as we have today individually in their home, there was a community oven that would be done. So it would be a community that would make sure that there's not any fire being kindled in their moshav on Shabbat. From a later scripture in the prophets, we see that carrying a load or a burden is prohibited in melacha, but there is sort of a caveat. What's the caveat going on in Jeremiah 17 that is the work that's being prohibited, carrying things to or from? What are they trying to do?
Building the wall.
I'm
I'm trying to remember what you're referring to. In Nehemiah, then the only other thing would have been the people trying to come in to buy or sell.
That's what's going on here as well. They ordered the gates shut so they would not be carrying burdens in to sell on Shabbat. And so this, in the context of carrying a burden or a load on Shabbat, is related directly to not selling the loads, trying to bring in to the market. So the market is closed. You're not allowed to come in and do that. which is the same. A similar passage is from Nehemiah 10, as well as the prophet Amos, about buying or selling on Shabbat is prohibited work. So causing others to work for you is prohibited. You can't force your children or your servants or your employees to work for you.
Have a Sabbath goy.
You're really not allowed to do that because that would be now what there are. I guess you could say there are attempted workarounds for that. If you're not paying them, you're just leaving your door unlocked so you can open the door and walk in and flip the light switch and move on out. That still would fall under the command of prohibited work. But the problem, in my opinion, is somebody turning on a light switch is not. I don't think that is actual kindling a flame. So I don't think there's an actual problem with turning a light switch on Shabbat. Electricity is different than the combustion that goes on with the fire, the chemical reaction. So you also can't make your animals work or your visitors work in your house. So those are things you can't force people to do, even though you can't rest on Shabbat and make your visitors work. So this is some years ago. We watched a video together. It was discussing the passage in Isaiah 58 that says, "Doing your own pleasure on Shabbat is prohibited." But what the video brought out, you can look that up on YouTube from 119 Ministries. Essentially, the doing your own pleasure, speaking your own way, doing your own ways, or speaking your own words is a euphemism for doing your occupation. So that's what's being spoken of about doing your own pleasure. It's not how we would term pleasure in the modern understanding of pleasure. It's not that. It's doing your occupation, what makes you money, essentially. Again, we're still going back to working for money. So are there any times you think that something else outweighs the command to not do melachah on Shabbat?
Vayaqhel, where you go and help somebody?
Well,
That's light and
Light and
heavy.
heavy.
It's, I'd say circumcision, for one, is specifically called out in some places.
I
But
see what you're saying.
helping widows, helping orphans, making sure poor people get fed, that kind of thing. I'd say you should be able to do that.
so the primary principle is that in matters of chesed,
Chesed.
Shabbat is loosed. Chesed, mercy, loving kindness, is of a greater weight than sacrifice because it's more important what to do. It's directly quoted from Hosea 6:6. And we know from various passages, including Vayaqhel 23 as well as Matthew chapter 12, that the sacrificial system is of a greater weight than Sabbath. So priests do work on Shabbat in the temple, and yet are held
You
guiltless
break
for
the
doing
Torah
so.
to keep the Torah.
Say again?
Break the Torah to keep the Torah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It's essentially saying that Shabbat is an important command. Obviously, it's a potentially a life or death sentence, so to speak. But there are things that you have to do on Shabbat because they're of a greater weight than resting. It's more important to do this than to not do it, or in other words, to rest on Shabbat. And that's
Police, fire, EMS, soldiering.
So healing, as we see from Yochanan 9, making clay in the process of healing and the act of healing itself are both considered to be permissible acts of chesed on Shabbat. We can see that in traditional Judaism, modern versions of that, it's also chesed is also of a greater weight. In other words, at least saving a life is understood to be of a greater weight than Shabbat. So we talked about feeding the hungry. We can kind of perhaps lump some of that into good deeds being permitted on Shabbat. Even reaping from a field is potentially permitted if it is required for the course of doing good in that same sense or saving a life. And since we know from Luke chapter 13, care for the well-being of animals is permitted on Shabbat. You can look at the Chal v'chomer of that is, if animals are allowed to be fed on Shabbat, how much more people, right? So animals that fall into pits or other life-threatening situations are to be helped out of their distress. That seems obvious, but there were groups, of course, at the time of the Second Temple period that did not believe that to be the case.
Right.
Qumran sect in particular.
Wasn't the Sabbath also the sign of the covenant between Hashem and his people?
It is, right.
Hopefully I didn't get too far ahead on you or something.
That's completely accurate. That's why we basically in our earlier on we were saying if you don't do Shabbat, you're cut off from your people. That is one of the things we read. So you can't be part of Israel if you don't do Shabbat. So as we talked about already, males are to be circumcised even on Shabbat. We talked about healing as well, but healing isn't commanded on Shabbat, but it seems to have a greater weight as doing good deeds, so it is permitted on Shabbat. As we mentioned already, saving animals' life permitted, how much more human life?
So question.
Yes.
So I was told, and you can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I was told that in Israel there are some sects of Judaism where if they see a ambulance go by, they'll throw stones at it because it shouldn't be driving on Shabbat. Is that real? If this is what it says, they wouldn't be doing that, would they?
I don't know if it ever happened in a situation of saving life.
That might have been Palestinians going on.
That's their normal thing. I was
I
always
think that throwing a rock might be breaking Shabbat too. So.
really. That's bad.
I would
More
say
skipping stones.
if they're in a part of the neighborhood that is so ultra orthodox to say we're going to throw stones at an ambulance, it wouldn't be happening because they consider throwing stones work. They wouldn't do it.
Well, lifting up the stone,
Lifting up a stone and then chucking it. Nah, wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
I'm speculating, of course, but
unless the stone weighs less than an olive,
a little pop.
a ripe olive. So, knowledge or da'at of Elohim is also of a greater weight than burnt offerings, again, back from Hosea. And so, with the temple service, which offerings are apart, has greater weight than Sabbath, so knowledge of Elohim is of a greater weight than Shabbat. So, thoughts on when may Melacha be done on Shabbat? Because I'm going to move to a different subject after this. If there's somewhat different subject.
It's pretty clear.
Okay. So, kindling a fire. We've talked a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that now. As I mentioned, it's from the root word ba'ar. Tevaru is in the intensified or causative action form, PL form. And you look at some of the the word on tevaru in the Peel form is to kindle or to burn, to figuratively to consume or remove of guilt is a listings of the form. So looking at it from a call is similar. It could be to burn or just to be burning. It seems more of a passive form. Call is more straightforward. Peel is the causative or intensification. But just looking at the words there doesn't always bring it about. There are there's essentially debates still ongoing about that between traditional Judaism and Karaite Judaism in terms of interpretation of the Shabbat. Essentially, you could get to whether or not to light Shabbat candles or not. It might be just a way of looking at that. So here's Art Scrolls Humash on the subject, which says the oral law, oral Torah, makes it clear that only the creation of a fire and such use as cooking and baking are forbidden. There is no prohibition against enjoying its light and heat. Deviant sects that deny the teachings of the sages misinterpreted this passage to refer to all use of fire, so they could sit in the dark throughout the Sabbath, just as they sat in spiritual darkness all their lives. So that's pretty. That's also throwing rocks, if you will.
Yeah, that's a serious rock there.
But even within Karaite Judaism, there are different viewpoints on that subject. For example, this one, Karaite blogger, the source is down below, is called From the Writer Hand, blogspot.com, wrote, in the early days of Karaism, the Rabbinites taunted us and accused us of being sitters in the dark, a reflection of some of Anan's early laws in which he would not permit a fire to be lit before the Sabbath so that there would be light in the home during the Sabbath evening. Perhaps a little too zealous in his interpretations and preserved for a long time by those who were part of the Ananite sect, at least common sense prevailed in the time of Kirkasani, which is not 890 to 960 circa. The acceptance of candles lit before Sabbath was reinstated. That's one Karaite view of that. Another is not that way. So there's differences of opinion on the subject, even within Karaite Judaism, for example. Another Karaite view says that Karaites traditionally interpret the verses forbidding the burning of a fire on Sabbath as meaning that no fire whatsoever may remain lit once the Sabbath comes in and until the Sabbath goes out. From this traditional interpretation comes the rabbinic tradition to make cholent, or hamin, on Sabbath. Hamin is a stew that is placed on the fire before the Sabbath and left to cook throughout Sabbath. Said the rabbis, if one refuses to make hamin on the Sabbath, one is suspected of being a Karaite. We should all be so lucky. And is the traditional Karaite understanding correct? Is the rabbinical way of seeing it correct? It's hard to know. One possible compromise in our modern age is to completely refrain from the use of fire on the Sabbath, but to permit the use of electricity. This is the approach that this website recommends. So there are different views of what is not considered to be melacha, particularly with regard to kindling a flame or letting it burn, even today or in modern times. So this week's portion was Shabbat Shekalim. And so this is some of the text. This is translation from the Aramaic side of it. But in the Aramaic version, it's 2 drachmas equals, I guess, a half shekel. That's how even though drachma is a Greek word, that's what was used for the coinage in the land at the time. When they came to Capernaum, those who were receiving the 2 drachmas for the poll tax came to Peter and said to him, "Does not your master give us 2 drachmas?" He said to them, "Yes." "What does it appear to you, Simon? The kings of the earth, from whom do they receive tribute and the poll tax? From their children or from strangers?" Simon said to them, "From strangers." Yeshua said to him, "Then the children are free. But so that this should not offend them, go to the sea and cast a fish hook, and the fish that comes up, open its mouth, and you will find a stater. Take that and give it to me, and give it for me and for you." So, a stater, I guess we double the 2 drachmas, so it'd be enough for both. So Kepha says that Yeshua pays a temple tax, but Yeshua indicates that neither himself nor Kepha owe it. Yeshua doesn't argue that he does not owe the ransom because he is Messiah. He extends the argument to Kepha or Peter, and so therefore possibly all of his followers as well. So is Yeshua here teaching against Torah?
No.
We agree that's a no. So the reason it's a no, we can look at what's going on at the time, or at least the halachot that's in play. So I don't think Yeshua is teaching against Torah. The Torah does indicate that a ransom must be paid by every male 20 and older, kitisa et rosh, the taking of the head count. The Pharisees said that this ransom had to be paid annually during the month called Adar, or the month before Passover occurs. So it would be really in the beginning of the month in which
That's all.
Purim actually is. It would be the last month of the year. But that was the Pharisaic halakha to do that. But the Qumran text and perhaps others viewed it differently. Here's what is written in Qumran. This is found in 4Q159. Concerning the ransom, the money of the valuation which a man gives as ransom for his life shall be half a shekel, in accordance with the shekel of the sanctuary. Only once will he give it in all his days. So if he paid it once, according to this halakha, it would already have been paid. So, of course, if there wasn't a census, you wouldn't even pay it then, right? So anyway, kind of some reasoning here. So if Yeshua held to the Qumran or Asin halakha, only when Kitas et Rosh B'nai Israel, or when the taking of the head count of the children of Israel, then he would not believe that he or Peter or any of his followers owe the tax if it had already been paid at least once in a lifetime, or if there had never been a census during their lifetime when they're 20 or older. So this would explain why Kepha said that Yeshua pays the tax, while Yeshua claims that he nor Kepha nor his followers owe the tax. So, short Midrash today. That's all I really have. Are there any questions for you or from you? That's Beit wants to know if you have any questions or any food.
Spike says aye.
Who's Dog's Taylor?
That I think is from
The groomer?
Zoom Groom. Yeah. Oh, she's dressed in her best Dachshund St. Patrick colors there. She says, "Sure, I'll eat your candy or whatever." So, if there are no questions, it's time for Havdalah.
Yay.
So we'll close the live stream out for Havdalah.